How convenient, Nathaniel Cole said, that the version naming you appeared after you'd have plausible deniability about writing it yourself. Vivian Hale would replay that sentence for weeks, not because of what it accused her of — she'd been accused of worse by better liars — but because of the stillness in the room after it. 10 people who had known her for exactly 4 minutes, all recalculating who she was based on 9 words from a man they trusted. She had a pen in her hand. She noticed that first. A strange, useless detail to fix on, but the hand remembers what the mind refuses to. She had been taking notes, the way she always did, because taking notes was something to do while other people's lives rearranged themselves in front of her. In the margin of her legal pad, in her own handwriting, were 2 words she had written 4 minutes ago without understanding what they would cost her. Co-trustee. She still didn't fully understand it. She only understood the way Nathaniel was looking at her now. Not confused, not searching, decided. A man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do and arriving in under 4 seconds at an answer he already hated. 4 minutes earlier, none of this had existed. 4 minutes earlier, Arthur Penn had cleared his throat over item 14 of a will Vivian herself had helped draft and read a clause she had never seen. I name Vivian Hale as co-trustee of the Cole Family Trust with equal standing to my grandson, Nathaniel Cole, for a period of no less than 1 year. She had looked up. Nathaniel had already been looking at her. She would understand only later how long that look had actually taken, because in the moment it felt instantaneous, a held breath compressed into something almost violent. He'd met her exactly once before, 11 days ago at his grandfather's funeral, for 90 seconds in a receiving line where he hadn't remembered her name. He remembered it now. "I'm sorry," he'd said, and his voice had been very calm, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. "Could you read that again?" Penn had read it again. The words hadn't changed. And then the accusation, the one she couldn't stop hearing. How convenient. "I didn't write that provision," Vivian said now, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own kind of professional muscle memory, built over years in rooms exactly like this one. "You're a lawyer, Miss Hale. You understand how this looks." She did. That was the problem. A young attorney, positioned close to an old man's fortune in his final months, walking away with equal standing in a company worth more than she'd earn in 4 lifetimes of honest work. She understood the shape of it perfectly because she had spent her entire adult life making sure she never stood inside a shape like this one. She had watched her father lose everything once: his license, his name, the version of himself he'd spent 30 years building, because a room decided, without proof, that the shape of a thing was the truth of it. Nobody had asked him what actually happened. They only needed it to look guilty enough to stop looking further. She had promised herself at 22 that she would never again sit in a room where people were allowed to see what was convenient instead of what was real. She was sitting in that room right now. "Mr. Cole," Penn said, in the voice of a man trying to remember he was technically still in charge of this meeting, "there are procedures for contesting a will. This is not the venue." "This is exactly the venue." He stood. He wasn't shouting. That was somehow worse. The leveled, contained fury of a man who'd learned young that losing composure was the same as losing. "My grandfather spent 6 months talking to this woman alone, in private, about how to restructure a company that took him 40 years to build. And now I'm told I don't run it alone anymore. I share it with her." "I didn't ask for this," Vivian said. "No," he said. "I'm sure you didn't." He said it the way you'd say, "of course," to a child's obvious lie. Not cruel exactly, but final. A door closing so quietly she almost didn't hear the latch catch. He looked at her for 1 more second. She would think about that second for a long time afterward. The particular quality of it. The way he seemed to be searching her face for something and not finding it, deciding its absence was the proof he needed. Then he picked up his folder and left. The door didn't slam. Somehow that made the silence worse than if it had. 11 people remained in the room. 10 of them were looking at Vivian. She sat very still, the way she'd learned to sit still a long time ago, in another room, watching her father's career come apart over something he hadn't done either. This is happening again, she thought. Not the same thing, the same shape. The same terrible, familiar shape of being asked to prove a negative to people who had already decided the answer. She looked down at her legal pad, at the 2 words sitting there in her own handwriting, waiting for her to understand what they meant. She had no idea yet that in a locked drawer in Harrison Cole's study, a drawer no one had opened since his death, there was a leather notebook with her name in it, not once, 14 times across 9 years, in handwriting that grew shakier with each entry, describing a woman Harrison Cole had never officially met. She only knew that the man who now controlled the rest of her professional life had just looked at her like something he needed to survive. 4 months before the reading of the will, Vivian Hale had walked into Harrison Cole's study for the first time and thought, "This is a room built by someone who has never once been told no." Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk older than the company it had helped build, and Harrison Cole himself, 78 years old, sitting very upright in a leather chair like a man who intended to die the same way he'd lived, in full control, on his own terms, in a room he owned. "You're younger than I expected," he'd said, by way of greeting. "You're older than your photographs," she'd said back, before she could stop herself. Something had moved in his face then, not quite a smile, but close to it. Later, she would wonder if that had been the moment, if a single unguarded sentence, tossed off out of nerves, had told him something he'd spent 9 years trying to confirm. She hadn't known that first afternoon that he already knew her name, that he'd requested her specifically from the firm. Not the senior partner who usually handled estates of this size, not the associate with more years of experience, but her, Vivian Hale, 31 years old, 4 years out of a mid-tier law school, a name that shouldn't have crossed a man like Harrison Cole's desk at all. She'd assumed it was random, a name pulled from a partner's recommendation, an availability slot that happened to be hers. She had been too flattered, too busy, too grateful for the opportunity to ask why. That was the first mistake. Not a mistake of law. A mistake of not asking why she'd been chosen, back when the answer might still have been simple to hear. Over 4 months, she'd come to his study 7 times. Only 4 of those visits had made it into any billing record. The other 3, Harrison had asked her to come without telling the firm. Personal matters, he'd said, waving a hand, and she'd let it go, because clients like Harrison Cole did not explain themselves, and she had learned not to expect it. In those meetings, he asked her things no client had ever asked a lawyer drafting their will. "Do you believe people can change?" he asked her once, apropos of nothing, while she was still organizing paperwork on his desk. "Or do you think we just get better at hiding what we already were?" She'd looked up, startled. "I think—" She'd paused, unsure why he wanted her opinion at all. "I think most people don't change. I think a few people do, and it usually costs them everything to do it." He'd nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. "And you? Which are you?" "I try to be the second kind," she'd said. "I don't know if I've succeeded." He'd smiled at that. A real one this time. "That's the only honest answer anyone's given me in about a decade." She had thought, at the time, that this was simply how very old, very rich men behaved when they were bored and had a captive audience. She had not understood that he was taking notes too, that every visit, after she left, he opened a drawer in that same desk and wrote down what she'd said, word for word, in a hand that shook a little more each time. She had not known about the drawer at all. The last time she saw him, 6 weeks before he died, he'd asked her to stay a few minutes after their business was concluded. He'd poured 2 glasses of something amber and hadn't offered her one, which she'd found strange, until she realized he was pouring the second glass for himself and simply hadn't noticed he'd made 2. "My grandson doesn't trust easily," he'd said, staring into the glass rather than at her. "I made him that way. I want you to know that before you meet him. Whatever he says to you, whatever he thinks about you, it isn't really about you at all. It's about every person who's disappointed him since he was 9 years old, and I'm at the top of that list." "I don't understand why you're telling me this," Vivian had said. "No," Harrison had agreed. "You don't. Not yet." He hadn't explained further. She'd assumed, walking out of the study that evening, that it was the rambling of an old man circling toward the end of something, the kind of cryptic weight people put on their words when they know they're running out of time to say things properly. She had gone home. She had billed the hour. She had not thought about it again until 4 months later, in a wood-paneled conference room, hearing her own name read into a clause she had never written, watching a man she'd met once decide in under 4 seconds exactly what kind of person she was. She would think, much later, about that evening with the 2 glasses of scotch, one of them never touched, and understand that Harrison Cole had not been rambling at all. He had been apologizing in advance for something he hadn't yet done to her. Vivian sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she trusted her hands enough to start the engine. She did not cry. She had trained herself, a long time ago, out of crying in parking garages after rooms like that one. Her father had taught her, without meaning to, exactly how much a public collapse cost a person trying to rebuild a reputation. She sat instead with her hands on the wheel, breathing in the particular contained way she'd learned to breathe when the alternative was screaming. She thought about her father. She always thought about her father in rooms like that one. It was an old reflex, worn smooth from use. 12 years ago, a partner at his firm had been caught laundering a client's money through a shell account, and rather than let the truth take the time it needed to surface, the firm had decided it was faster to let it look like her father had known. He hadn't. It had taken 4 years and most of his savings to prove it. And by the time he was cleared, no one wanted to hire a 60-year-old lawyer whose name still came up on page 2 of a search result next to the word fraud. She had watched him become smaller every year since. Not bitter, exactly, just smaller. A man who used to fill a room, now apologizing for taking up space in one. She had built her entire career as a rebuttal to that. Every case taken cleanly, every appearance of impropriety avoided before it could even be born. She did not date clients, she did not accept gifts, she kept her name deliberately boring. Vivian Hale. Competent, unremarkable, nothing for anyone to write a headline about. And now her name was in a will worth $400 million, and a man with her father's exact expression from 12 years ago, the specific, cornered look of someone realizing the story was already being written without them, was standing 11 minutes away, telling people that story right now. She started the car. She did not go home. She went back to the office, back to the file room, back to every draft of Harrison Cole's will she still had access to, determined to find the exact moment where a clause with her name in it had been added, and by whom, before anyone else decided the answer for her. Nathaniel Cole was waiting for her in the hallway outside the file room, which meant she had been waiting for close to 40 minutes because Vivian had told no one where she was going. "How did you know I'd be here?" she asked. "I didn't." He was leaning against the wall in the particular way of a man who wanted to look like he wasn't bracing for something. "I've been standing outside every room in this building you might logically go to. This was the 4th one." It was such an absurd, oddly honest answer that for a second, Vivian almost laughed. The reflex arrived and died in her throat before it reached her face, because nothing about the situation had earned a laugh yet, and she suspected it might be a while before anything did. "I want to show you something," she said, and gestured at the folder under her arm. 5 minutes, then you can go back to hating me with better information." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement, but its close cousin, the involuntary muscle response of a man who had, against his better judgment, just found something funny. He didn't smile, but he followed her into the small conference room off the file archive, and he sat, and he waited. She spread 4 documents across the table. "This is every draft of your grandfather's will that passed through my hands, dated, time-stamped, initialed by both of us at every revision." I pointed to the final page of the last one. "This is the version I saw on the day of our final meeting, 6 weeks before he died. Read the last clause." Nathaniel read it. His jaw tightened. "This doesn't mention you at all." "No, it doesn't." She let that sit for a second. "Item 14 in the will that was read this morning isn't in any draft I worked on, which means one of 2 things happened. Either your grandfather made a change after our last meeting, without my knowledge, using a different attorney, or you're lying and this is a forged paper trail." "Or that," she agreed evenly. "You're welcome to have your own counsel verify every timestamp against the firm's internal records. I'd actually prefer that. I don't want you taking my word for anything right now. I want you to check." He looked up at her, and for the first time since the reading of the will, the look on his face wasn't pure hostility. It was something more complicated. The look of a man who had walked in ready for a fight and was being handed, instead, an invitation to go verify the fight was real. "Most people," he said slowly, "when they're accused of something, don't hand over the evidence that could clear the other person too. Most people aren't used to being accused of things they didn't do," Vivian said, and heard too late how much more she'd revealed in that sentence than she'd meant to. Nathaniel caught it. She watched him catch it, the small tilt of his head, the recalibration behind his eyes. That sounded personal. It wasn't. It was. She said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer, and she despised herself a little for that, for the years of practice at controlling a room that apparently had not extended to controlling this. "I'm not going to explain my life story to convince you I'm not a con artist. I don't think that's a negotiation I should have to make. I think the paperwork should do that job. If it doesn't, then no story I tell you will either. You'll just think I'm good at telling stories, which, given that I'm a lawyer, you probably already assume." Something in his posture shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. The way a man shifts his weight when he realizes the ground isn't quite where he thought it was. "My grandfather," he said, "did not make impulsive decisions. He didn't add a clause like that, control of a $400 million trust, as an afterthought to a woman he had apparently met a handful of times without a reason. And I don't believe for 1 second that the reason was your paperwork skills, however good they are." "I agree. I don't think it was random either." That surprised him. She watched it land, the flicker of a man expecting a defense and receiving instead an admission that nothing added up. "Then what was it?" "I don't know." And this, at least, was entirely true, in a way that seemed to cost her something to say out loud. "I've spent the last 2 hours trying to find that answer in 4 months of file records, and I can't, which means whatever the actual reason is, isn't in anything I have access to." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Vivian made herself hold still under it. She had done this before, in depositions, in hearings, in every room where someone had looked at her trying to decide if she was telling the truth. She knew how to hold still. She did not know this time why it mattered to her more than usual that he believe her. "There's a study," he said finally, quietly, like the words cost him something too. "In his house. He kept things in there he didn't keep anywhere else. No one's been through it properly since he died. If there's an answer, it's probably there." "Then we should look." "We," Nathaniel repeated, and the word came out flat, testing its own weight. 20 minutes ago, I thought you manipulated an old man out of half his company." "You can keep thinking that while we look," Vivian said. "I'd rather you verify it and be wrong about me than trust me and be wrong about that.
Distrust that checks its work doesn't bother me. It's the kind I respect most, actually. He looked at her for a second too long after that, long enough that she felt it, a small current under her skin she immediately, deliberately ignored. "Tomorrow morning," he said, standing. 9 o'clock, the house. Don't be late, and don't come with your own agenda about what we're supposed to find there." "I don't have an agenda. I have less information than you do. That's not a comfortable place to stand, Mr. Cole, whatever you think it looks like from the outside." He paused at the door, hand on the frame, and looked back at her, not hostile this time, just uncertain, which was somehow a harder expression to watch on him than the anger had been. 9 o'clock, he said again, and left. Vivian sat alone in the small conference room for a long moment afterward, looking at 4 stacks of paper that proved nothing except that she was telling the product apart she actually knew. She thought about the study, about what Harrison Cole might have written down, in 9 years, about a woman he claimed to have met only recently. She did not let herself, yet, think about the current under her skin and what it might mean that she'd wanted Nathaniel Cole to believe her for reasons that had very little to do with a $400 million trust. That would come later. Tonight, she only let herself think about the study and the drawer inside it that no one, not even Nathaniel, knew existed yet.
Vivian did not sleep that night. Not really. She lay in the specific, alert half-dark of someone rehearsing a conversation that hadn't happened yet, and wouldn't until 9 a.m. the next morning. At 2 a.m., she gave up and turned on the lamp beside her bed. She'd brought home a copy of everything. The 4 verified drafts, her own billing records, the calendar entries for every meeting with Harrison Cole she could account for. She spread them across the comforter the way she used to spread case files across her childhood bedroom floor, back when she was young enough to believe that enough organization could out-argue any accusation. "How convenient," Nathaniel had said. She kept hearing it, not because it was cruel, she'd survived worse, but because some small, traitorous part of her kept asking the same question he had. What if it wasn't convenient? What if you did something, said something in a meeting you don't fully remember that made this happen, and you've simply told yourself a cleaner story since? She hated that voice. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize an old injury flaring in bad weather. It wasn't really about Harrison Cole's will at all. It was the same voice that had kept her, at 22, awake for months after her father's firm collapsed, running his old case files at 3 a.m., searching for some hidden mistake he must have made, because the alternative, that a man could do everything right and still be destroyed by other people's decisions, had been too frightening a thing to accept about the world she was about to enter as a lawyer herself. She had never found a mistake. Her father hadn't made one. That had somehow been the worst part, not the best, because it meant that being careful, being clean, being right was not actually a form of protection. It was just something you did, and sometimes the world burned you down anyway, and no amount of doing everything correctly bought you out of it. She had built her whole adult life refusing to accept that lesson. And now, at 2 a.m., surrounded by paperwork that proved she'd done nothing wrong, she found herself doing exactly what she'd done at 22, searching for the hidden mistake, just in case being innocent wasn't enough this time either. She made herself stop at 2:40. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at her kitchen table and did what she always did when the spiral got too loud. She made a list. Facts. She had drafted 4 verified versions of Harrison Cole's will. None contained her name. Item 14 existed only in the final, executed version, a version she had never seen, produced by means she could not yet identify. Harrison Cole had met with her 7 times, 3 of them off the books, for reasons he never fully explained. He had asked her personal questions, unrelated to the estate, about change, about honesty, that she had assumed, at the time, were simply the idle curiosity of an old man. 6 weeks before his death, He had told her that his grandson didn't trust easily, and that whatever Nathaniel thought of her wouldn't really be about her. At the time, she had thought, he meant be patient with my grandson. He carries old wounds. Now, at 3 a.m., rereading her own memory of it with new eyes, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like a man preparing her for an impact he already knew was coming, like an apology delivered in advance because he wouldn't be alive to give it after. She thought, he knew. He knew exactly what this morning would look like, and he let it happen anyway. Which meant the real question wasn't, why did he choose me? It was, why did he think this was worth doing to me, whatever the reason was? By 4 a.m, she had stopped trying to sleep and started, instead, doing the only thing that had ever actually settled her mind, working the problem like a case. She pulled every scrap of correspondence she had with Harrison Cole's office, emails scheduling their 7 meetings, a firm invoice for the 4 billed sessions. She noticed, for the first time, something she'd been too busy to register in the moment. The 3 off-the-books meetings had all been scheduled not by Harrison's assistant, but by Harrison himself, from a private email address she didn't recognize, one that didn't appear anywhere else in the firm's records. She wrote the address down, stared at it, hc.privatestudy@. Not his business account, not the address his assistant used for the 4 official meetings. A separate, quieter channel, used only for the conversations that had never made it into any billing record. The same conversations where he'd asked her whether she thought people could change, where he'd poured 2 glasses of scotch and only drunk from 1. She thought about the study Nathaniel had mentioned, a room no one had been through properly since Harrison died. She thought about the drawer she didn't yet know existed, and the notebook inside it, and the 14 entries written in a hand that grew shakier each time, though she had no way of knowing any of that yet. She only knew with the particular, cold certainty of a lawyer who had spent all night circling the same unanswered question, that whatever this actually was, it had started long before yesterday morning. It had started, she was beginning to suspect, years before she'd ever walked into that study for the first time and thought, this is a room built by someone who has never once been told no. At 8:15, she showered, dressed, and drove to Harrison Cole's house to meet a man who had spent the entire previous day deciding he hated her, carrying with her a private email address, a half-finished list of facts, and a question she still didn't have the courage to say out loud. What if the reason he chose me isn't something I'm going to want to know? Nathaniel was already standing outside the house when Vivian arrived, which she noted and did not comment on, because arriving early to a place you technically co-owned wasn't the kind of thing that needed explaining. The house itself was smaller than she'd expected, not a mansion in the way the company's valuation might have suggested, but an old stone colonial, the kind of house a man builds once and refuses to trade up from out of some private theory about what wealth is actually for. I had a locksmith come this morning, Nathaniel said, by way of greeting. The study's been locked since the funeral. No one's had the code but him. You didn't go in without me. It wasn't a question, but he answered it like one. No, I told you we'd look together. I meant it. A pause. I also don't fully trust what I'd feel if I found something in there alone. It was, she would think later, the most honest thing he'd said to her yet. More honest, in its way, than the accusation had been, because it cost him something to admit it. The study was exactly as she remembered it from her 7 visits, the same oversized desk, the same wall of books that looked red rather than decorated, the same window seat where Harrison used to sit while she organized paperwork on the desk. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco he'd told her he'd quit 20 years ago, and clearly never fully had. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a long moment without entering. I haven't been in this room since I was a kid, he said.
He used to bring me in here when I did something wrong. Not to punish me, to test me, I think, is the better word. He'd give me a problem, a puzzle, sometimes a moral question dressed up as a business scenario, and he'd watch how I answered it. I didn't understand until I was maybe 20 that he was grading me the whole time. I just thought we were talking. Vivian said nothing. She recognized the shape of what he was describing, not the specifics, but the architecture of it, a childhood spent being quietly evaluated by someone who called it conversation. "Is that why you don't trust easily?" she said, before she could stop herself, and then immediately wished she could take it back. Too personal, too soon, exactly the kind of assumption she'd have hated someone making about her father. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "That's a very direct question from a woman who told me yesterday she wasn't going to explain her life story to convince me of anything." "You're right. I apologize." "I didn't say I minded." He finally stepped into the room. "Yes, that's probably why." They worked in silence for a while after that. Nathaniel going through the bookshelves, Vivian through the desk, both of them circling the obvious fact that neither of them knew exactly what they were looking for. The desk drawers held what she expected: old correspondence, contracts, a few photographs so old the color had gone amber. It was in the third drawer, beneath a stack of decades-old shipping ledgers, that she found the folder. Not the notebook, not yet, just a folder containing perhaps a dozen photographs and newspaper clippings, all old, all yellowed at the edges. She almost set it aside as irrelevant. Then she saw the top photograph. Her father. 30 years younger, standing outside a courthouse she recognized from her own childhood memory of visiting him at work, shaking hands with a man she did not immediately recognize, until she looked closer and understood with a jolt that went through her whole body that the man shaking her father's hand was Harrison Cole, younger, dark-haired, unmistakably him. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked, seeing her go still. She didn't answer immediately. She was reading the clipping beneath the photograph, a newspaper article, local, decades old, about a business dispute, a lawsuit, a case in which a young attorney named Edward Hale represented a client against significant pressure to settle and won, preserving something the article didn't fully explain. The client's company had been called Cole Manufacturing. "My father," Vivian said slowly, "represented your grandfather before I was born or when I was very young. I've never heard this. He never told me he knew Harrison Cole. He never told me he'd ever worked with him at all." Nathaniel crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the clipping. His expression had changed. The guarded hostility of the day before had given way to something more like the look of a man watching a floor he thought was solid reveal a trapdoor. "You didn't know," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No." Vivian's voice had gone thin. "I didn't know there was any connection between our families at all. I thought, when I was hired to draft his will, it was a coincidence, a recommendation from a partner. I never once thought to ask why Harrison Cole specifically wanted a lawyer named Hale." She looked up at Nathaniel, and for the first time since the reading of the will, they were looking at the same evidence and arriving for once at the same bewilderment instead of opposite conclusions. "He knew who I was before I ever walked into this house? He didn't discover me. He found me, on purpose, because of my father." "Why wouldn't he tell you?" Nathaniel asked. "If it's this simple, a debt, an old case, gratitude to your father, why hide it? Why not just say so?" "I don't know." Vivian set the folder down carefully, as if it might come apart in her hands. "I don't think it's this simple. I think this is the beginning of the reason, not the whole answer." She thought of the private email address, of the 14 off-the-record meetings that had never quite made sense as idle curiosity, of the 2 glasses of scotch and Harrison telling her 6 weeks before he died that whatever Nathaniel thought of her wouldn't really be about her at all. "It's about every person who's disappointed him since he was 9 years old," Harrison had said, "and I'm at the top of that list." She was beginning to understand, with a cold, careful dread, that she might be standing at the edge of something Harrison Cole had spent 9 years building towards, and that a debt to her father, however real, was only the first and simplest layer of it. "There's more," she said quietly. "I can feel it. This isn't the whole answer." Nathaniel looked at the folder, then at her, and for the first time, the look on his face wasn't suspicion at all. It was something closer to dread shared evenly between the two of them, the particular vertigo of two people realizing at the same moment that the ground beneath both their lives had been arranged by someone else a long time ago for reasons neither of them yet understood. "Then we keep looking," he said.
They stayed in the study for 3 more hours, and somewhere in the second hour, without either of them announcing it, the nature of the silence between them changed. It stopped being the silence of two people who didn't trust each other. It became the silence of two people working the same problem, which was a different thing entirely. Vivian had forgotten, a little, what it felt like to sit across from someone and not have to manage what they thought of her. "Your father," Nathaniel said, somewhere past noon, setting down a ledger he'd been reading. "Did he ever mention coal manufacturing, even once? A case from that long ago?" "No." Vivian had been asking herself the same thing for hours. "But I was 6 years old when that clipping was dated. If it happened before I was old enough to remember, and he never brought it up afterward..." She stopped. "There's something else. My father doesn't talk about his old cases. Not the ones he won, not the ones he lost. He stopped talking about his work entirely after..." She caught herself. "After what?" She hesitated. This was further than she'd meant to go, further than she'd gone with anyone outside her own family in years. But something about the room, or the 3 hours, or the shared vertigo of the folder made the sentence come out anyway. "After his career ended, 12 years ago. A partner at his firm laundered a client's money, and it was easier for everyone if it looked like my father had known it. He hadn't. It took 4 years to clear his name, and by the time it was cleared, no one wanted to hire him anymore. He stopped talking about being a lawyer at all after that. It's like he decided the whole profession had been a mistake he'd wasted 30 years making." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's why you keep every piece of paper," he said slowly. "Yesterday, in the conference room, you didn't hand me evidence because you're naturally that organized. You handed me evidence because you've watched what happens to someone who doesn't have any." It wasn't an accusation this time. It was, she realized with something like surprise, an act of understanding, the first one he'd offered her since they'd met. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm sorry," he said. "For yesterday. Not for asking the questions, you're right that I should have, but for how I asked them." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't owe me an apology for being careful about who gets close to your family's company. I'd have asked worse in your position." "Maybe, but I decided you were guilty before I had any evidence you were. That's different from being careful." He turned the ledger over in his hands. "My grandfather did that to people too. Decided what they were, and then only saw the parts of them that confirmed it. I told myself for years I was nothing like him. Yesterday, I was exactly like him." It was, Vivian thought, a harder thing for a man like Nathaniel to say than it looked. She recognized the specific difficulty of it, the same difficulty she'd have naming a resemblance between herself and anyone who'd wronged her father. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're like him. I think you're afraid of becoming him, which isn't the same thing and is actually a fairly reliable way of not becoming him at all." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but its quieter cousin. "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Reframing things so they sound less damning than they feel. I imagine that's useful in your line of work." "It's useful in every line of work," Vivian said. "Most people are their own harshest witness. Someone has to cross-examine that testimony occasionally." He laughed, short, surprised, like it had got past him before he decided to allow it. It was the first time he'd heard him laugh, and she noted, with some private irritation at herself, that she wanted to hear it again. They found the second drawer's false bottom at almost 4 in the afternoon. Nathaniel found it, actually, running his hand along the underside of the drawer out of some old habit, muscle memory from a childhood spent, apparently, cataloging every hiding place in this house during games no one else had known were games. Beneath it, a stack of folders, more recent than the first, spanning what looked like years rather than decades. Photographs of Vivian herself. Not surveillance style, nothing sinister in composition, but clearly taken without her knowledge. At law school graduation, at a courthouse steps, once unmistakably at a coffee shop near her old apartment years ago. A version of herself in her mid-20s she barely recognized. Her stomach turned over. "He was watching me," she said quietly, "for years. Not just knowing about my father, watching me." Nathaniel didn't say anything for a moment, and when he did, his voice had gone careful, the voice of a man choosing not to make a bad moment worse. "I don't think it's what it looks like. Not like that. Whatever this is, I don't think it's sinister. Look." He pointed to a note clipped to one of the photographs, in Harrison's unmistakable handwriting, shaky even in the earliest entries. "Graduated top of her class, turned down the corporate track for public interest work her first 2 years. Good sign." Good sign, Vivian read, and thought, a sign of what? "There's a notebook," Nathaniel said slowly, looking deeper into the space beneath the false bottom. "Not photographs. Handwriting. A lot of it." He drew it out carefully, worn leather, the kind that had clearly been opened and closed hundreds of times over years, the spines soft with handling. Vivian's hands, when she reached for it, were not quite steady. "Do you want me to read it first?" Nathaniel asked. "If it's whatever it is, if it's about you, you don't have to find out with me standing here." It was, she thought, an extraordinarily generous thing to offer from a man 24 hours ago had accused her of engineering her grandfather's death for money. "No," she said. "I want to see it, whatever it says. I've spent my whole career being told what other people decided about me without being in the room when they decided it. I'm not doing that again." Nathaniel nodded and handed her the notebook and said nothing further, just moved his chair a little closer, close enough that she understood, without him saying it, that he intended to be there when she opened it, whatever it turned out to hold. She opened to the first page. The handwriting on the first page was steadier than she expected, an old man's hand, but a deliberate one, each letter formed with the care of someone who considered writing itself a kind of promise. Entry 1, September. I met Edward Hale's daughter today, quite by accident. She was arguing a motion in a courtroom I happened to be sitting in for an unrelated matter. I did not know, walking in, that she was his daughter. I only knew, watching her, that she reminded me of someone I have spent a great many years trying to become and have mostly failed at. A person who says true things in rooms where it would be easier not to. I asked a clerk her name afterward, Vivian Hale. I did not tell anyone why I wanted to know it. Vivian read the entry twice. Nathaniel, beside her, said nothing, though she felt him go very still. "I don't remember that," she said quietly. "A motion. I argue motions constantly. I have no memory of a man watching me in the gallery." "You wouldn't," Nathaniel said. He was good at not being noticed when he didn't want to be. It's a skill. I used to think it was charm. I've come to think it was mostly just patience. She turned the page. Entry 2, December, same year. I have looked into Edward Hale's history more than I probably should. What happened to him 12 years ago, the accusation, the years it took to clear his name, was, I believe, a genuine injustice, and I confess some of my interest in his daughter began there, a small, private guilt, since I once, decades earlier, benefited from Edward Hale's integrity in a matter of my own, and did very little to repay it beyond a handshake and a fee. But that is not, I find, the whole of why I keep returning to this.
I have watched a great many people in my life pretend to be good in order to be seen as good. I do not believe, from what little I have observed of his daughter, that she is one of them. She does not seem to know anyone is watching. That, more than anything, is rare. Vivian's throat had gone tight. He knew about my father's case, specifically, not just that it happened, the details. You said it took 4 years to clear him. That kind of thing doesn't stay quiet in legal circles. If he was already curious about you by then, he'd have had every reason to look into it. She nodded, though she didn't fully feel the reassurance in it. She kept reading. Entry 4, the following spring. I arranged, through a contact at her firm, to have a minor filing of mine reviewed directly by her. Nothing that mattered, a formality I could have handled myself in 10 minutes. I wanted only to see how she treated a piece of work beneath her level when she believed no one of consequence was watching. She did it thoroughly, better than the assignment required. When I later mentioned, through my contact, that the work had been adequate, she asked, through the same contact, whether there had been a specific error she should correct for next time, since adequate seemed to imply she'd fallen short of something. She had not fallen short. I had simply wanted to see if she needed to be told she'd succeeded in order to know it. She did not need to be told. I confess I found this more moving than I expected to. Vivian sat back slightly. He tested me, on purpose, multiple times before I ever met him. He did that to everyone, Nathaniel said, and something in his voice had gone flat, old, tired in a way that made her look up at him. I told you, that was the study. That was every conversation I ever had in this room as a child. I just didn't know until this exact moment that he'd done the same thing to someone outside the family. I supposed I assumed that particular cruelty was reserved for people who couldn't leave. I don't think this was cruelty, Vivian said carefully, though she understood why it might look that way to him. I think, she searched for the right way to say it, I think this was a man who didn't trust his own judgment enough to just ask someone if they were good. He needed proof he could point to later, for himself, maybe, not just for anyone else. Nathaniel didn't answer that. He turned to the next several entries himself, reading in silence for a while, and Vivian let him, understanding that whatever he was working through belonged to a different, older wound than the one currently unfolding in her own chest. She kept reading. Entry 7, 2 years in. I have begun to wonder whether I am doing something unforgivable. I tell myself I am simply gathering information, the way I gather information about any decision of consequence. But I do not gather information about strangers this way. I do not know why this particular stranger has become to me a kind of proof I am chasing. Proof that a person can be entirely good without an audience, without reward, without ever being asked to perform it. Nathaniel does not believe such people exist. I made him that way. I am beginning to understand that I need her to exist specifically in order to prove to myself that I did not entirely fail him, that somewhere in the world is evidence for a kind of goodness I never managed to model for my own grandson, and that it is not, therefore, impossible for him to someday recognize it if he ever meets it. I do not yet know what I intend to do with this. I only know I have started keeping this notebook because I no longer trust myself to remember honestly why I began watching her in the first place, and I would rather have the truth in my own handwriting than a story I've told myself so many times it no longer resembles what actually happened. The room was very quiet. Vivian became aware distantly that her hands were shaking slightly, and that Nathaniel had noticed and had not said anything about it, which she was grateful for. Nathaniel Fallenfeld Peffer. 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 Nathaniel He wasn't testing you to torment you. He was testing you because he needed you to be real. For my sake, apparently, though I don't think he ever planned on telling me that while he was alive. Nathaniel, Vivian looked at him directly, this means the will, the trust, the co-trustee clause. It isn't a random test of your character, and it really isn't a business decision at all. Whatever it is, this notebook is evidence it started years before either of us knew we'd be in a room together. I know, he said. His voice had gone rougher than before. I'm trying to decide whether this makes this better or worse. She didn't have an answer for that either. She turned the page, expecting more of the same, careful, guilty, half-confessional entries about a stranger he'd watched from a distance. Instead, she found a page that had been torn out, not missed, not naturally aged loose from the binding, torn, deliberately, close to the spine, leaving only the very last line of whatever had been written above it, cut off mid-sentence. And by the time she is old enough to understand what I've done, I will already be gone, which means the only person who can explain it properly to her is... The sentence ended there. The next page began mid-entry, months later, as if whatever had been written on the missing page had simply never happened. Vivian stared at the ragged edge for a long moment. Someone took this page, she said, recently. Look at the tear. It's clean, not decades old like the rest of the binding. This happened after he died. Nathaniel went very still beside her. Which means, Vivian said slowly, someone else has already read what we're reading right now, and they didn't want us to see what came next.
Vivian's phone had been buzzing steadily for the last 40 minutes, and she had ignored it out of some instinct that whatever was happening in this study mattered more than whatever was happening outside it. When she finally checked it, she understood she'd been wrong. 14 missed calls, all from the firm. 2 texts from a senior partner she rarely heard from directly. Call me the moment you see this. Marcus Reyes has filed something. Who's Marcus Reyes? She asked, already dialing. Nathaniel's expression had changed the instant she said the name, the particular tightening of a man hearing a threat he'd been half expecting arrive early. Chief Operating Officer. He's run the company's day-to-day for 11 years. He was supposed to be named sole interim director if anything happened to my grandfather before I was ready to take over fully. Then the will named me instead. He's been polite about it for exactly as long as it's taken him to find an opening. The partner answered on the first ring. Vivian? Thank God. Reyes's counsel filed an emergency motion an hour ago, petitioning the court to freeze the trust's voting authority on the grounds that the co-trustee provision was, quote, procured through undue influence exercised on a dying man by his own estate attorney. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. He's naming me specifically? He's naming you specifically, and he's requesting an expedited hearing, Thursday. If the judge grants the freeze, even temporarily, neither you nor Nathaniel Cole can exercise any trustee authority until it's resolved, which could take months. Reyes petitions to remain interim director in the meantime. Under the bylaws, if the freeze holds past 90 days, the board can vote to make his interim status permanent. That's not a coincidence. The timing. He filed this the same day we found. She stopped herself, aware that Nathaniel was listening, aware that this wasn't a call to have in front of him, without knowing yet what she meant to say. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. She hung up. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of controlled dread, the same stillness he'd had reading his grandfather's notebook. He's moving to freeze the trust. Undue influence. Says I manipulated your grandfather into naming me. That's absurd. It's not absurd, it's smart, Vivian said, more sharply than she meant to. It's exactly the argument I'd have made if I were opposing counsel and had no other angle. He doesn't need it to be true. He needs it to be plausible enough to freeze the authority for 90 days, and he knows the optics of yesterday's will reading already do half his work for him. Nathaniel exhaled slowly.
So he's using the same story I believed for the first 4 minutes of this. Yes, except he has 90 days and a company to gain from believing it, and you didn't.
They drove back to the office together. Nathaniel's car, Vivian too rattled to trust her own judgment behind a wheel, and spent the drive in the specific, focused silence of two people who had, without either one announcing it, stopped being separate parties to a dispute and started being co-defendants in one. "I need to know something," Nathaniel said, eyes on the road, "and I need you to answer honestly, because we're about to walk into a room with people who are going to ask it far less kindly than I am. Ask it. Is there anything at all in your history with my grandfather that could be twisted to look like undue influence, even if it wasn't? A conversation, a gift, anything Reyes's people could find and misrepresent?" It was, she recognized, exactly the right question, asked exactly the right way. Not an accusation this time, but due diligence, the kind she'd have demanded of any client in his position. "No gifts," she said. "No off-book payments, nothing outside the 4 billed sessions on record. The 3 private meetings weren't billed, which could look strange out of context, but they're documented in his own calendar from his own private email, which I didn't control and can't be accused of fabricating." She paused. "The notebook is the only thing that could genuinely hurt us. If Reyes's people get access to it before we understand what it actually says, they could frame 9 years of your grandfather's private reflections as proof of a manufactured relationship, proof I cultivated him deliberately over years for exactly this outcome. Then we don't let them get access to it. Legally, once litigation is filed, if it's material to the dispute, we may not have a choice. Discovery could reach it regardless of what we want." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to know everything that's in it before anyone else does, including whatever was on that torn-out page." Agreed. Vivian looked out the window, watching the city slide past, thinking of the ragged edge of paper, the sentence that ended mid-thought. "By the time she is old enough to understand what I've done, I will already be gone, which means the only person who can explain it properly is who?" "There's something else," she said slowly. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Whoever tore that page out had access to a locked study that only your grandfather's attorney controlled the code to. That's a very short list of people. Reyes wasn't on it, was he?" "No." Nathaniel's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "The only people with any legitimate reason to have been in that house since the funeral are family, or staff who've worked here for decades and would have no reason to." "Then someone in your family already knows what's in that notebook," Vivian said, "and decided we shouldn't." Neither of them said anything for a while after that. The implications sat between them, heavier than the lawsuit, heavier even than the accusation of undue influence, because a stranger's greed was simple to fight, and a family member's calculated silence was not. By the time they reached the office, the firm's senior partner was waiting in the lobby, along with 2 other attorneys Vivian recognized from litigation, and the particular energy of a building that had learned in the last hour that a very expensive fight had just begun. "We have until Thursday to file a response," the partner said, falling into step beside them. "Reyes's petition leans heavily on the optics of the will reading, the surprise, your presence in the room, Mr. Cole's initial reaction becoming, unfortunately, part of the public record already, since 3 people in that room apparently couldn't help themselves and talked to a reporter friend by lunchtime." "It's in the press?" Vivian asked, her stomach dropping. "Not yet published, but it will be, likely by tonight. Mystery attorney inherits equal control of coal industries alongside embattled Heir is, I'm told, close to the working headline." The partner glanced between them. "I need to know, before Thursday, exactly what your relationship to Harrison Cole actually was. Not the version that will hold up in court. The true version, whatever it is. Because if there's anything in your history together that Reyes's investigators can find before we can control how it's presented, I need to know today." Vivian looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her, and something passed between them. Not quite an agreement, but the shared understanding that they were now, whether either of them had chosen it or not, standing on the same side of a line that had not existed 48 hours earlier. "There's a notebook," Vivian said finally. "You should sit down." The senior partner had taken the notebook, photographed every page, cataloged it, locked the original in the firm's document safe under a chain of custody that would, she'd assured them, hold up regardless of what Reyes's investigators tried. The litigation team had dispersed to draft the response. By 9 that evening, the office had emptied out around them, the particular hollow quiet of a building after everyone sensible has gone home. Vivian found Nathaniel still in the small conference room where this had all effectively started 2 days ago. Alone, a single desk lamp on, the copied pages of the notebook spread in front of him, though she doubted, by this hour, he was actually reading them anymore. "You should go home," she said. "There's nothing left to do tonight that can't wait until morning." "I know." He didn't move. "I keep thinking about the torn page, trying to finish the sentence myself. The only person who can explain it to her properly is—" He shook his head. "I have 4 guesses, and I don't like any of them." She sat down across from him, without quite deciding to. "Tell me the worst one." "That it's me." He said it quietly, almost like a confession, that whatever he wanted you to understand about why he chose you, what he actually wanted from this, he intended me to be the one to tell you. And I don't know it. I don't know what I'm supposed to be telling you, which means either I'm about to fail at the one thing he actually asked of me without knowing I was asked, or someone in your family tore that page out specifically because they didn't want you to be the one who found it, which means they know something you don't, and they're choosing, right now, to keep it that way. He nodded slowly. Outside, the city had gone dark enough that the office windows had turned into mirrors, and Vivian caught, briefly, both their reflections in the glass, 2 people who 48 hours ago had been strangers deciding the worst about each other, now sitting 3 feet apart in an empty room, past the point of pretending this was only a business arrangement. Can I say something that might sound strange, given everything? You can try. I keep thinking that whatever he actually wanted, whatever this whole elaborate, invasive 9-year project actually was, it wasn't really about the company at all. Reyes thinks this is a fight over control of a business. My family will spend the next 90 days treating it as a fight over money, but I don't think that's what any of this was ever about to him. He gestured at the pages. I think he spent 9 years building something, and none of us were supposed to find out what it actually was until it had already happened. Until what had already happened? He looked at her directly then, and something in his expression made the question feel less rhetorical than she'd meant it. I don't know yet. That's what worries me. Vivian didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the entry that had unsettled her most. I need her to exist specifically in order to prove to myself that I did not entirely fail him, and what it meant to have spent 9 years as someone else's evidence without ever being told you'd been enrolled in the case. I keep coming back to something, she said finally. We're both talking about him like he did this to us, and maybe some of it was that, the surveillance at least, was a violation, whatever the intention behind it. I haven't made peace with that part yet, and I don't think I should have to pretend I have to. She paused. But there's another way to read it too. He didn't just choose me because he needed proof for himself. He also, I think, actually believed I might be good for you, not as a controlled experiment, as a person he'd watched for years and genuinely thought, might be someone worth knowing on your own account, not just his. That's a generous interpretation of being spied on for 9 years. I'm aware. She almost smiled. I contain multitudes. I can be furious about the surveillance and still wonder if the outcome he was hoping for wasn't entirely wrong. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen yet. Not suspicion, not guardedness, but a kind of unguarded attention that seemed to cost him something to allow. "He used to say something to me," he said slowly, "when I was maybe 16, after I'd failed one of his tests badly enough that I'd stopped speaking to him for a week. He said, 'The people who deserve your trust rarely announce themselves. You have to be paying attention long before you need to know, or you'll miss them entirely.'" He shook his head. "I always thought he meant it as a warning. Be careful, trust is dangerous. I'm only understanding right now that he might have meant the opposite, that he spent 9 years paying attention so that when the moment came, he'd already known." "Know what?" asked Vivian. "That you were someone worth putting in a room with me. Whatever this is, the company, the trust, the lawsuit Ray has just filed, I think underneath all of it, that might genuinely be the simplest true thing he was trying to do. Introduce us. In the only way he knew how, which was apparently an elaborate 9-year background check and a will worth $400 million. Vivian laughed briefly, surprised into it, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself since the reading of the will. "That is the single most needlessly complicated way to arrange an introduction I have ever heard." He was not a simple man. "No," she agreed, "he clearly wasn't." They sat in the quiet a while longer, neither of them moving to leave, the copied notebook pages between them like a shared inheritance neither had asked for and neither could quite put down. Vivian was aware distantly of how strange it felt to feel this settled sitting across from a man who 2 days ago looked at her like an enemy, and aware too that the settling itself was a kind of evidence, the same kind Harrison Cole apparently spent 9 years collecting. Not proof extracted under test conditions, but proof that showed up quietly, on its own, when nobody was grading it. "Thursday," Nathaniel said. "The hearing. Reyes is going to use every ugly interpretation of that notebook he can find. Let him try. We have the true version. He has a guess dressed up as an accusation." She gathered the copied pages into a neat stack, the old reflex of order reasserting itself. "We should go home, both of us. We're no use to Thursday if we're useless tonight." Nathaniel nodded and stood, and for a moment, neither of them moved toward the door, the small remaining distance between them suddenly more noticeable than it had been all evening. "Vivian," he said eventually, "whatever he was actually trying to build here, I don't think it's finished. Whatever's on that torn page, I think we're going to end up living out the rest of it whether we mean to or not." "I think you're right," she said quietly. Neither of them knew yet how right that was going to turn out to be, because neither of them had checked their phones in the last hour, and neither of them yet knew that the reporter with the mystery attorney story hadn't waited for tonight. It had already published 40 minutes ago, and it did not say what either of them expected it to say. Vivian's phone lit up the moment she stepped out of the office building. 6 missed calls compressed in the last 40 minutes, all from numbers she didn't recognize, the specific signature of a story that had just gone live and was now being chased by people who wanted comment on it. She opened the first link a colleague had texted and felt the ground move slightly under her. The headline was not the one the senior partner had warned them about. Exclusive. Harrison Cole's final secret. The attorney named in his will may be the daughter of a man he once destroyed. "Nathaniel." Her voice came out strange even to her own ears. He was still 10 feet behind her, locking the office door, and something in her tone made him cross the distance quickly. She turned the phone so he could read it. The article was long, clearly rushed to publish, sourced to a person close to the Cole family with knowledge of the estate's history, and it told a story Vivian had never heard, constructed from fragments that were true in isolation and devastating in combination. 34 years ago, attorney Edward Hale represented Cole Manufacturing in a dispute that, according to court records, resulted in a settlement so favorable to Harrison Cole that a rival executive later accused Cole of having improperly influenced Hale's representation of the opposing party, an accusation that, sources say, was never formally investigated at the time. 12 years ago, Edward Hale's own career would collapse under strikingly similar accusations of improper financial influence at a different firm under different circumstances, a collapse from which he never recovered. Now, Harrison Cole's will grants equal control of a $400 million trust to that same attorney's daughter. "You have to ask what he was really settling," said the source. "A debt to a man he'd once wronged, or something he needed the daughter to never look into too closely." Vivian read it twice. The second time, her hands had gone cold enough that she noticed the phone shaking slightly in them. "This isn't true. None of this. I've never heard any accusation about my father and your grandfather working together improperly. There's no version of my father's history that includes Cole Manufacturing. The clipping we found today was the first I'd ever heard of any connection at all." "I know," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone hard in a way she hadn't heard from him since the reading of the will, though this time it wasn't aimed at her. "This is not investigative journalism. This is someone taking two true facts that happened decades apart and stitching them together into an insinuation, then feeding it to a reporter who was already primed to run with anything that made today's story bigger." "A person close to the Cole family," Vivian looked up at him. "Nathaniel, that's not Reyes. Reyes doesn't have access to family history like this. He's an executive, not blood." Nathaniel had gone very still. "No," he agreed slowly. "It isn't Reyes. It's the same person who tore the page out of the notebook. It has to be." He stared at his phone now, too, scrolling through the article with the particular fury of a man recognizing a family member's hand in something ugly. Whoever did this knew about the Cole Manufacturing case. That's not public information. I didn't even know about it until 3 hours ago, and I grew up in that house. This came from someone who's had access to things neither of us has. Which means whatever was on that torn page wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous enough that someone in your family decided the safest move was to get ahead of it, to control the story before we could find the truth ourselves. They didn't leak this to protect the company from Reyes's lawsuit. They leaked it to protect themselves from whatever your grandfather actually wrote. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had dropped to something quieter, almost unwilling. "There's only one person in my family who had unsupervised access to that study before the locksmith came this morning, who's had a key to that house independent of the estate's official access log for over a decade." "Who?" He looked at her, and the look on his face was the look of a man about to say a name he'd spent his whole life trusting out loud as an accusation for the first time. "My aunt," he said. "Diane, my grandfather's daughter, my mother's sister." "Why would she—" "I don't know yet." His jaw tightened, "but I intend to find out tonight." Vivian's phone buzzed again, a text from the senior partner, terse, urgent. "Have you seen it? Call me now. This changes our Thursday strategy entirely. We may need to address your father's history directly before Reyes's counsel raises it in front of the judge." She stared at the message, feeling something cold settle into her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the old familiar dread of watching a story about her father's integrity get written by people who had never met him for an audience that would believe whatever version was published first. "I need to call my father," she said quietly, "before he sees this from someone else." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, and it was, she understood, the first time in this entire ordeal that he apologized for something that wasn't his doing at all, apologizing simply because someone he loved had caused her pain, and he felt the weight of that regardless of blame. Vivian nodded, throat tight, already dialing her father's number, bracing for a conversation she'd hoped never to have, the one where she'd have to ask a 62-year-old man who had spent 12 years rebuilding a life around never being asked about his ruined reputation again, why a newspaper was suddenly asking whether he'd once done something improper for Harrison Cole. The phone rang twice. Her father picked up on the third ring, and before she could say anything at all, he said, in a voice she had never heard him use before, quiet, resigned, already exhausted by a conversation that hadn't started yet, "You've seen it then." Vivian's stomach dropped through the floor. "Dad, what aren't you telling me?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Nathaniel, watching her face change, reached out and steadied a hand on her arm without seeming to decide to do it. "Vivian," her father said finally, "there are things about Harrison Cole and me I never told you, not because they're what that article says, but because they're worse in a way, and better in another, and I always thought I'd have more time to explain it to you myself before you had to find out this way." "Explain what?" Another silence. "I think," her father said slowly, "not over the phone. This isn't a phone conversation." The line went quiet. Vivian stood on the sidewalk outside a darkened office building, phone still pressed to her ear, Nathaniel's hand still steady on her arm, and understood with the particular falling certainty of someone watching the last solid ground of a story give way beneath her, that whatever had been torn out of Harrison Cole's notebook, her own father had apparently been carrying the rest of it, quietly, for years.